and welcome to Challenge Solutions. My name is Caitlyn, and in this video I'll be sharing 10 tips for science teachers with blind or visually impaired students. These tips are primarily directed toward elementary and high school science teachers, but some can be applied to the college classroom as well. These tips can be applied to any kind of science class, be it an elementary school science class, anatomy, biology, or even chemistry. My first tip is to maintain constant communication with both your student and their TVI, or teacher of the visually impaired. The college equivalent of this will be your university access office. It is important to maintain communication with both your student and their vision teacher in order to make sure that they are prepared for what is coming up in the class. You need to let your student and their TVI know what is coming up so they can check the material for accessibility and make sure that it doesn't need to be adapted. And if it does need to be adapted, it's important that they get it ahead of time so that they can make any modifications that need to be made. All blind people are different, just like all sighted people are different, so every visually impaired student is going to have a unique set of strengths, weaknesses, and needs. I can give you a generalized list of guidelines for making your class accessible, but ultimately only the student and their TVI can tell you what is best for that particular student. It's important that you communicate with them to make sure that their needs are being met in the best way possible. Communication is key to success for any student, but especially for visually impaired students. Tip number 2 is be descriptive when you are teaching. Some science classes can have a lot of visual elements, and it is important that your blind student understand the visual context for what is happening in the class. If you're doing a visual experiment, make sure you explain what is happening visually as well as the significance of what is happening. Also, be sure to describe the visual layout of things like chemical equations and any kind of math that happens in your science class. It may be necessary to get visual elements of your class to the TVI ahead of time so they can adapt them into a tactile format or provide some sort of alternative explanation for your student. If your student is a Braille reader, it is very important to get math-based assignments to your TVI ahead of time so that they can transcribe them into Braille, as it can be very, very difficult for Braille readers to follow mathematical lessons based on audio feedback alone. Tip number 3 is use accessible materials. Many aspects of science classes are not accessible. For instance, if you have your students doing interactive activities online, chances are they're not going to be accessible to your blind student using assistive technology. Make sure that you're using materials that your blind student can access easily. One option is to give them assignments out of the textbook if they have a Braille copy of the book or a digital copy that they can access, or just make sure that you get any kind of handouts to the TVI ahead of time. You can give online assignments to your student and TVI to check ahead of time to make sure that they are going to be accessible and modify as needed. If an assignment is inaccessible and you want your sighted students to participate in it anyway, you can get it to the TVI and they will be able to either modify it to make it accessible or come up with an alternate assignment for your blind student to complete. One option is to have your visually impaired student do work out of the book or do another kind of worksheet while your sighted students are doing interactive activities. It is important to note that things like Kahoot and similar interactive things will not be accessible to your blind student, so an alternative assignment will need to be created. Tip number 4 is use tactile manipulatives whenever possible. As stated previously, many elements of science classes are very visual and it can be difficult for your blind student to follow what is happening. There are a variety of tactile manipulatives available for a variety of different science classes that can be used to supplement your in-class auditory instruction. For instance, you can get things like a Braille periodic table and already made tactile graphics for animal and plant science. You can also get things like a tactile chemistry kit from the American Printing House for the Blind that can be very instrumental in helping your blind student understand visual concepts. I personally use the chemistry kit from APH, which I will link in the description, to do most of my chemistry assignments. The chemistry kit has Braille and print numbers and symbols that can be affixed to a felt board with Velcro, so both your student and you as a sighted teacher can understand what's happening, and you can demonstrate concepts to your student in a way that they can understand, and they can demonstrate their understanding of those concepts. I personally use this kit to complete most of my chemistry assignments. I would complete the assignments on the Velcro board with the print and Braille manipulatives and take pictures of my work to submit to the teacher for credit. If you're teaching an anatomy class, something that can be very helpful is to get a model of a skeleton, and then you can guide your students' hands to the bones and use this as a reference for what you were talking about. This, for me, was much more beneficial than trying to follow auditory explanations or use even tactile graphics. No matter what kind of science class you are teaching, there are probably Braille and tactile manipulatives available for it that can supplement your teaching. I will link some of the ones that I used in the blog post associated with this video, which will be in the description below. Tip number 5, make sure experiments are accessible and inclusive. A lot of experiments performed in a lot of science classes are very visual in nature. For instance, anything involving light is going to be very difficult for your blind student to follow. I also remember doing experiments like layering different colors of liquid in a clear pitcher to see how they would combine and stay separated, which was hard for me to understand because I can't see colored liquid in a glass pitcher. We also did several things like making models with colored paper clips, which was not helpful for me because I can't see the different colored paper clips. It is important to consider how much your blind student is going to be able to get out of a given experiment. Some experiments are simply not helpful for blind students, and it might be more beneficial for them for you to write up a detailed description of what happens in the experiment and allow them to complete their assignment based on that description. Other times, you can adapt the experiment to be more inclusive. For instance, in the example using colored paper clips to create models, one solution would be to use differently shaped paper clips or differently shaped links. That way I would have been able to understand what people were referring to and complete the experiment in a similar fashion to my sighted students. If you really want to be inclusive, you can use different shapes for all of your students, not just your blind student. That way everyone has the same materials, and sighted students will be able to use the different shapes just as easily as your blind student would, especially if each shape is also a different color. Also, in my 8th grade science class, we did a project where we used different colored candies to help explain balancing chemical equations, and my science teacher went above and beyond to find different shaped candies for me to use so that I could do a similar project as my sighted peers in an accessible way. Minor changes like this can really help your blind student feel included and make sure they understand the material. Also, one option if you have your students working in groups is to let your blind student be the note taker for the group. So all the sighted students can do the actual experiment and explain what is going on, and the blind student can record their research findings and be responsible for submitting the worksheet for the group. This is something that you will want to discuss with your blind student and their TBI. Different blind students are going to be comfortable with different things when it comes to experiments. Some may not be comfortable being responsible for turning in the worksheet because they may not be as familiar with assistive technology or may not be comfortable trying to type and format things in that kind of environment. Also, some blind students may be comfortable pouring things or measuring things for the group, but others may not. I'm personally pretty confident in my ability to measure and pour as long as I'm not dealing with chemicals that could cause harm if I did spill a couple drops. But other blind students are not as confident in these skill sets and may prefer to simply record the information or just be provided with a text-based description of what's happening and do their own kind of project while everyone else is performing the visual experiment. Again, your student and their TBI will be the best resource for this situation, as they will be able to tell you how to best meet that individual student's needs. Tip number 6 is lessen the workload for some assignments. It is not necessary to lessen the workload for all aspects of a science class, but some assignments can be very difficult and time-consuming for blind students. For instance, balancing chemical equations can take a very long time if you're trying to do it in Braille or with a screen reader. Any math-based assignment is going to be very time-consuming for your blind student because math is very visual and much more difficult to complete using assistive technology. be things like making models of atomic structures. Even if you do have a set of tactile manipulatives, are going to be more time consuming. If your student can demonstrate that they understand the concept by doing 10 problems, there is no reason to make them do the 100 problems that the rest of your sighted students are being asked to complete, because they're going to spend way longer on it than your sighted students will. This is something that you can talk to the TVI about, and they will be able to tell you if it is necessary to lessen the workload or not. Tip number 7 is work one-on-one with your blind student as needed. Some blind students are going to need more help in science classes, just like some sighted students are going to need more help in science classes. If you're doing a lot of visual work on the board, your blind student may need a little supplemental instruction. It can be beneficial to work with them either before or after class, just to go over the visual aspects of the class or mathematical concepts or anything that they might struggle to follow as you are teaching in the actual class time. It can also be beneficial to use things like wiki sticks, which are wax-coated strings that can be used to make tactile representations of things on the fly, to supplement any kind of drawings that you do on the board. If you work one-on-one with them, you will be able to better gauge what they are and are not grasping in class, and you can provide them with supplemental explanations and manipulatives to help reinforce the point. This is where communication comes into play. As long as you're communicating well with your student and their TVI, you will be able to gauge whether one-on-one instruction is necessary, and encourage your student to advocate for themselves and let you know where they are struggling and if they need you to work with them separately. Tip number 8 is adapt group projects as needed. I touched on this previously with the experiments a little bit, but group projects can be very difficult for blind students in science classes, especially if the assignments are visual in nature. Some group projects will be perfectly fine for your blind students to complete. For instance, if they're just looking up answers in the book and filling out a worksheet or doing a research project, your blind student may be able to keep up perfectly fine. But if you are putting your students in groups to perform a visual experiment, your blind student may struggle. Many sighted students don't know how to interact with a blind student efficiently in a way that they can understand, so it can be stressful on both the blind student and the sighted students in their group, and could place both parties behind depending on the nature of the assignment. Again, one option for visual assignments is to have your blind student be the note taker if it is something that they can accessibly record. For instance, if the assignment involves sketching things, you probably don't want your blind student trying to do that, but if they're just filling in the blanks or recording research findings that the sighted students can report to them, then this may be an option. You will want to work with your student and their TVI on a project-by-project basis to see if group work is something that they're comfortable participating in. One option is to have them do an alternative assignment while the sighted students are in groups if the group project cannot be adapted suitably, or this can be an opportunity for you to work one-on-one with them while your sighted students are working in groups. Again, this will be handled on a project-by-project basis, and you will want to discuss it with the student's TVI to see how to best modify assignments for your student. Tip number 9, provide video and image descriptions and video transcripts. Something that was commonly used in my science classes were crash course videos, which can be very beneficial, but also very difficult to follow if you are a blind student. If you have your students taking notes over videos, it will be hard for your blind student to keep up because it can be slower to record information depending on what assistive technology they are using, and they don't have the luxury of being able to pause, rewind, and fast forward in a time efficient and accessible manner a lot of the time, depending on where the video is being played. Video transcripts can be very useful for your blind students because it allows them to read the information instead of just trying to follow it auditorily or on the screen. And they can also keyword search the transcript document for key terms that they need to find and take notes on. Also, if there are a lot of visual elements to the videos, you will need to provide the context for what is happening on screen if it's not apparent based on the audio. And if you are using a lot of images like infographics or charts, you're going to need to provide visual descriptions of these as well so that your student can understand the information. Another option is to get this material to the TVI ahead of time so that they can turn them into tactile graphics or hard copy braille depending on the material. It is important to note that you need to get this material to the TVI at least a week in advance, more so if possible, as making video transcripts and converting things to tactile formats can be very time consuming, and your student may not be their only student. Tip number 10 is challenge your blind student just like you would any sighted student. Science classes can be harder for blind students to participate in depending on the nature of the class, but ultimately they are capable of being successful. Many blind students go on to work in the STEM field and are perfectly capable of excelling in scientific fields. Your student may struggle in some areas, but they have the ability to succeed if not excel in your class, assuming that their needs are met and things are modified to be accessible and inclusive. Your students will be forever grateful if you help them challenge their thinking and excel in your class rather than simply allowing them to slide by because they're visually impaired and will need a little bit of extra help. I personally am very grateful to all the teachers who went above and beyond to make sure experiments were inclusive and that I could fully participate in everything that my class did, and who went out of their way to make sure that I understood difficult concepts. It may be hard and you may not know what to do, but there are resources available, and as long as you are willing to put in the work to help your student succeed, your student will also be willing to put in the work to understand the material, and I guarantee you they will thank you after the fact, even though they may hate the process of doing the work in the moment. That is my last tip for science teachers with blind or visually impaired students. If you have any questions, please leave them in the comments below, or send us an email via the contact form on challengesolutions.org. Also, if you are a blind or visually impaired student and you have some tips that we did not include in this video, please drop those in the comments as well so we can all learn from each other, and your tips may be featured in a future video or blog post. Please give this video a thumbs up if you found it helpful so the YouTube algorithm continues to know we exist. And remember to subscribe to our blog, podcast, and YouTube channel for more content like this. Thank you for watching.